Welcome back to Park Ranger. Narrative tonight's story begins at a ranger station so remote, even the radio signal didn't always make it out. The reservoir gave the town back. They flooded a whole valley to make our reservoir in the 1940s a town, a church, a cemetery, all of it under 100 feet of water for 80 years. The AT runs along the ridge above it now. In the drought 2 summers ago, the water dropped 40 feet, and the town came back up out of the lake. We should have let it stay drowned. I was on the crew that went down to look. I work for the Water Authority, not the Park Service, but our land butts right against the trail, and the ridge path looks straight down on the reservoir. Everyone local knows the story. In the 40s, they built the dam, condemned the valley, moved who they could, and flooded the rest: homes, the mill, the church, and the old graveyard. They swore they'd relocated, but as it turns out, mostly didn't. The drought 2 summers back was the worst on record. The reservoir dropped and kept dropping, and by August the water was 40 feet low, and the dead town was standing in the open air for the first time since my grandfather was a boy. You could see it from the trail of the church steeple first, then roof lines, then whole stone foundations, all of it slick and black with 80 years of mud laid out in the drained basin like a drowned man on a table. The authority sent a crew down to assess the structures for safety, since hikers were scrambling down off the trail to gawk. I was on it. We went down into the basin in waders, into that valley of black mud and dead buildings, and I will tell you the smell alone should have turned us around. Not rot, exactly. Older than rot. Mineral and cold. The smell of a place that has not breathed in 80 years. The buildings were wrong in the way drowned things are wrong. Everything sagged, doors swollen shut. The church bell, still in its collapsed steeple, furred green. But the buildings weren't the problem. The graveyard was. They had not moved the graves. The official record said relocated. The basin said otherwise. As the mud dried and cracked in the August sun over the following days, it shrank, and it pulled back from what it had been holding, and the cemetery surfaced. Stones, yes, but also the graves themselves, opened by 80 years of water pressure and the slow give of saturated ground. They were not empty, and they were not arranged the way a flooded graveyard should be. The coffins, the ones that had floated and resettled, had not drifted at random. They had collected. Dozens of them, surfaced and beached in the drying mud, were gathered in a tight ring in the open ground between the church and the lake bed's lowest point. All of them oriented the same way. Lids toward the center, like spokes. Like something had spent 80 submerged years patiently arranging the dead into an audience around a single empty patch of mud. We stood at the edge of that ring in our waders, and nobody said the obvious thing, which was that water does not do this. Water scatters? Water does not gather the drowned into a wheel and point them all at one spot. We left. We reported the structures unsafe, recommended no public access, and the authority fenced the trail overlook. Then the autumn rains came hard and early, and the reservoir filled back up over the course of a few weeks, and the town and the graveyard and the ring of waiting coffins went back under 100 feet of black water where, the official position holds, everything is fine. Here's what I can't put down. The week before the water covered it again, I went back to the overlook on the trail, alone, with binoculars. The ring of coffins was still there in the drying basin, but the empty patch of mud, they were all pointed at the center of the wheel, wasn't empty anymore. Something had been set down in it, upright, about the size of a standing man, dark and slick, facing the church. I could not make it resolve through the glass, no matter how I focused. And the next morning when I came back to look again, the rain had started, and the rising water had already swallowed the center of the ring, and whatever stood there went under first. What the strip mine uncovered, I ran a drag line at a surface mine that shares a fence with the national forest the trail crosses. Our job is to peel back the mountain a layer at a time. Most of what we expose is rock older than anything alive. But 1 week, we cut down into a seam that had a space in it, a hollow that nothing natural makes, and inside that sealed pocket, miles deep in solid stone, was something that had been put there on purpose, by hands. Before there were supposed to be hands. I'm a heavy equipment operator. I run a drag line, a machine the size of a building that strips overburden off a coal seam, peeling the mountain down in benches. It's the opposite of mining as people imagine it. We don't tunnel, we remove. We take the top off the world and dig down through time. The deeper we cut, the older the rock. And most of it hasn't seen daylight since before there was daylight to see. Our permit butts against the national forest, and you can see the AT on the ridge from the high benches. The hikers hate us, and I get it. But this isn't about the politics. It's about what we found in the seam. We were cutting down through a face we'd shot with explosives the day before, clearing the rubble, and the bucket pulled back a slab, and there was a hole behind it, a void in the rock. Now voids happen, gas pockets, old solution caverns, but a natural void is rough, irregular, the shape physics makes. This one had corners. It was a room, roughly cubic, maybe 10 feet on a side, hollowed into solid stone at a depth where the rock around it was hundreds of millions of years old, sealed on every side with no crack, no passage, no way in or out. A sealed room in stone that predated by an unfathomable margin anything that could have built a room. We shut the drag line down. You don't keep digging when the hole has corners. The company sent a geologist, then another, then men in better clothes who didn't introduce themselves. I was the one who'd exposed it, so I got to stand there while they argued, and I got to see inside before they sealed the site. There were things in the room. I'll describe them plainly because plain is all I can manage. Set into the floor of that sealed stone chamber are objects of worked metal, not corroded, not fossilized, bright, arranged in a deliberate pattern, geometric, around a central depression. And in the central depression was an impression, pressed into the solid rock floor, of a shape that had lain there. Long, segmented, far too large. The rock had closed around it and held its shape the way clay holds a hand, except the rock was a 250 million years old, and the shape was not of anything in any fossil record I've ever heard a geologist name. The men in good clothes told us the seam was exhausted and reassigned the whole crew to a different cut 2 ridges over, though they backfilled the void. I watched them do it not with our spoil, but with truckloads of graded fill brought in special, and then a cap of concrete. And the official maps now show that bench as completed and reclaimed. But here's the part. The night after we exposed it, before they sealed it, the seismographs the company runs, they monitor for blast compliance. It's required recorded a series of events from the location of that void. Not blasts, not settling, rhythmic, low frequency originating from inside the sealed chamber we'd opened in a rock mass that should be seismically dead. The pattern repeated for 6 hours and stopped at dawn. I saw the readout before it disappeared from the file. It wasn't random. It had the spacing of something moving or something knocking from the inside in a room we'd just unsealed after 250 million years of whatever passes down there. For patience. I quit the mine. I don't go near that ridge. And I don't look at the trail that runs above it because the void is capped. But the thing the rock remembered the shape of was not in the room when we opened it. The impression was empty. The graves. They moved for the highway. When they widened the highway that the trail crosses, they had to relocate a tiny family cemetery in the right-of-way 6 graves, a job I was contracted to do. Disinterment is routine work. I've done hundreds. But one of those 6 graves had been buried with precautions. Iron bands around the coffin, a stone slab on top, and a marker underneath the headstone, facing down, that said in plain English, "Do not move me." I run a company that does cemetery relocations. It's a real and unglamorous trade. When development hits a burial ground, somebody has to do the careful, legal, respectful work of moving the dead, and that somebody is often me. I've relocated hundreds of graves. It's archaeology with paperwork. It is not, in my experience, frightening. The dead are extremely cooperative. The highway project needed a tiny family plot moved out of the widening footprint 6 graves, 19th century, up a slope near where the AT crosses the road. Routine. We pulled the permits, did it by the book, opened each grave with care. 5 of the 6 were exactly what you'd expect. Old wood gone to nothing, bone, a few buttons, the quiet remains of ordinary dead people, moved without incident to the new plot. The 6th was different from the moment we cleared the topsoil. It had been buried wrong, or rather, buried with intention. Most graves are just a box in the ground. This one had a stone slab laid over the coffin lid, heavy, deliberate, the kind of thing you do to keep something down, not to honor it. Under the slab, the coffin was bound with iron bands, wrought iron, rusted but intact, wrapped around it the long way like a parcel you don't want coming open. I'd seen old graves with odd folk customs before, but never this much hardware, never this much engineering aimed at keeping a lid shut. And there was the undermarker. The headstone above ground was blank, weathered smooth, no name. But when we lifted the slab set into the coffin lid, facing up at us was a second stone. Small and carved into it, still legible, were the words, "Do not move me. Let me lie. Whoever reads this, cover me back." My crew wanted to do exactly that. I'll be honest, so did I. But the law is the law. The grave was in the right-of-way. The highway was getting widened with or without my conscience, and if I walked away, someone less careful would do it. So I made the call I've regretted every day since. I documented the warning, and I moved the grave anyway. The iron bands fought us. They were rusted, but they did not want to come, and when we finally cut them and lifted the lid, there was nothing inside but the wrong amount of nothing. No bones, nobody. No remains at all, but the inside of that coffin was scored deeply with long parallel gouges in the wood on the inside of the lid and the inside of the walls. The unmistakable marks of something that had been closed in and had spent a very long time trying to get out. The iron bands and the slab and the warning weren't to keep grave robbers from getting in. We relocated the empty, clawed coffin to the new plot with the others, because that's what the contract said. I reburied it. I did not put the warning stone back. I gave it to the Historical Society where it sits in a drawer. The thing I carry is this. The relocation was 3 years ago. In those 3 years, 4 people connected to that job have had the same experience and described it to me independently, my 2 crewmen, the surveyor, and the Historical Society volunteer who cataloged the stone. Each of them, at home, in their own beds, has woken in the dark to the sound of something raking long, parallel scratches down the inside of their bedroom door. From the hallway, slow, patient. The sound of something that was closed in for 150 years, finally let out, going room to room, door to door, reading the warning we should have obeyed and looking for the ones who didn't. It hasn't come to my door yet. I lie awake listening for it. I think it's saving me for last, because I'm the one who gave the order. The sinkhole in the bog. There's a high bog the trail skirts a peat wetland, acidic, cold, the kind of ground that doesn't rot what it swallows. A sinkhole opened in it after a wet spring, and the collapse drained one corner of the bog and exposed what the peat had been preserving for who knows how long. Bog bodies, people call them, except these weren't lying down. They were standing, and they were facing the hole. I'm a wetland ecologist. I study peat bogs, which sounds like the least frightening job on Earth, and usually is. Bogs are extraordinary places, waterlogged, acidic, oxygen-starved, so hostile to decay that they preserve organic matter for thousands of years. People know this from the famous bog bodies in Europe, Iron Age people, pulled out of peat, with their skin and hair and last meals intact. We have bogs in the southern Appalachians too, high cold ones, and I monitor one the trail edges past. After an unusually wet spring, a sinkhole opened in the bog. The limestone under the peat dissolved and gave way, and a section of the wetland collapsed and drained into the void, pulling the water down and exposing a face of peat like a cut cake, 10 feet deep, in the drained corner. I went out to document the collapse. Sinkholes in karst are normal. I expected to log it and leave. What I found in the exposed peat face stopped me cold. There were bodies in the peat. That alone wasn't shocking. I'd half expected the bog might hold a body, some lost hiker from decades past, even something prehistoric. But there were many. And they were not lying as bog bodies lie, settled flat by the weight of accumulating peat over centuries. They were upright, vertical in the peat, standing preserved mid-stance, a whole crowd of them at different depths, which means different eras. The deep ones impossibly old, the shallow ones more recent, all of them standing and all of them at every depth, oriented the same way. They were facing the sinkhole. Or rather, they were facing the spot where the sinkhole had just opened, which means they had been placed or had walked in and stood, facing a future collapse across thousands of years, all of them knowing where the ground would one day give way and pointing themselves at it like a congregation facing an altar that wasn't there yet. I want to be precise because precision is my whole training. Peat accumulates slowly, roughly a millimeter a year. The depth range of those standing bodies spanned several meters. That is thousands of years of people of different cultures, of different centuries, each one walking into the same cold bog and standing in the same orientation, facing the same point and letting the peat rise around them, while they stood waiting for a hole that opened only this spring. I did not go down into the drained corner. I photographed the peat face from the edge. And yes, the photos are real, and yes, they show what I'm describing. Rows of preserved, upright human figures at descending depths, and then I called the authorities because that many human remains is a legal matter, and I backed away. The state came. Archaeologists came. And then the bog did what bogs near sinkholes do. The void below kept dissolving, and over the following month the whole drained corner slumped and collapsed further, and the peat face caved in and reburied everything it had shown me. By the time the experts had their permits, there was nothing to excavate but churned mud and a deeper, wider hole. Here's what the experts never got to weigh up because the bog took it back. In the lowest, oldest part of the peat face, below the deepest standing body, the sinkhole had opened into a void, and the void was not empty. In my photographs, in the black mouth of the hole at the very bottom, there is a shape the cave should not contain. It is large, and it is pale against the dark, and it is the thing all those people, across all those thousands of years, walked into a freezing bog to stand and face and wait for. The collapse reburied it before anyone official saw it. I have the photos. I have shown them to no one. I think the bog wanted to keep waiting, and I think I should let it. The foundation we poured. I build mountain houses, the big ones, for people who want a view of the trail from their deck. Before you pour a foundation, you excavate, and before you excavate a remote mountain lot, you're supposed to survey it. We surveyed. The lot was clean. But when we dug the footings 8 feet down in undisturbed soil that no one had touched, we found a floor. A finished stone floor, level and swept, with the legs of furniture still standing on it. And the house that floor belonged to had never existed above the ground. I'm a builder. High-end mountain homes, the kind that go up on remote lots near the trail for people with money and a hunger for a view. The work is straightforward until it isn't, and the part that isn't is usually the ground. We had a lot, steep, wooded, gorgeous, with a sight line straight to the ridge, the AT runs. We did everything right. Survey, soil test, perk test, the works. The lot was virgin ground. No record of any prior structure, no foundation, nothing on any map or deed, going back as far as the county keeps records. Clean. We brought in the excavator to dig the footings for the foundation trenches 8 feet deep, down through soil that every test said was undisturbed mountain earth. And 8 feet down, the excavator bucket scraped across something flat and hard and rang like struck stone. We cleared it by hand, thinking ledge rock. It wasn't ledge. It was a floor. Fitted stone, cut square, laid level and tight, mortared finished. A constructed floor 8 feet below the surface of ground that had never, by every record and every test, held a building. We kept clearing. The floor extended in every direction, room-sized. And standing on it, in their original positions, sunk in the soil that had somehow filled the space above an intact floor without disturbing it, were the legs and lower portions of furniture. A table, chairs around it, the bottom of what had been a cabinet against one wall. A furnished room with a swept stone floor 8 feet underground, with no house ever built above it and no disturbance in the soil that buried it. The soil above the floor was undisturbed. That's the part the geologist we called could not make work. You cannot bury a finished, furnished room under 8 feet of undisturbed, naturally stratified soil. To bury it, you'd have to disturb the soil. The stratification said the earth above that floor had been settling, untouched, for a very long time, but the floor it sat on was swept clean, and the chairs were pulled out from the table as if the people had just stood up. We stopped work. The client, to his credit, didn't want to build on it, would you? And the lot got tied up in questions nobody could answer. The county had no record. The Historical Society had no record. There had never been a house there. There was just a furnished room underground that the world had grown up over without disturbing, with the chairs pushed back like the meal had just ended. Here's what made the client walk away entirely and made me hand the job to my foreman and stop visiting the site. We left the excavation open one night, tarped, planning to bring an archaeologist the next day. When we came back in the morning, the soil over the rest of the floor, the part we hadn't dug, beyond our trench had settled, slumped, the way ground slumps when the space beneath it is suddenly occupied when something that was empty underneath is empty no longer. The undisturbed earth beyond our dig had sunk several inches across the whole footprint of that buried room overnight. Something came back to the furnished room in the night, came back home, and the chairs that had been pushed out from the table when we found them visible at the edge of our trench were pushed back in, tucked under, set right, the way you leave a table when you finish sitting at it and you expect to sit again. We backfilled the trench ourselves and walked away from the contract. Some lots, you let the ground keep. The Drained Lakes Inventory. A small private lake near the trail had to be drawn down for dam repairs, drained almost entirely. Decades of water pulled off to expose the dam face. I was the engineer overseeing it. When a lake comes down, you find things. Lost boats, fishing gear, the occasional car. We cataloged it all. But there was an inventory the lake had been keeping that no accident explains every single thing that had ever drowned in that water. Laid out on the mud in rows, sorted by kind. I'm a civil engineer. I do dam safety. When an earthen dam needs its face inspected and repaired, you draw the reservoir down, pull the water off over weeks until the structure's exposed. I've supervised a dozen drawdowns. They're tedious, and they always turn up junk, because a lake is a slow-motion collector of everything that falls into it. You find sunken John boats, decades of lost tackle, beer cans, the occasional dumped car, sometimes something grimmer that becomes a police matter. This was a small private lake, spring-fed, near where the trail passes, maybe 80 years old, never drained in living memory. We pulled it down over 6 weeks, and as the water retreated, it left a widening apron of black mud. And on that mud, the lake gave up what it had been holding. It wasn't scattered. Everything that had ever gone into that lake and stayed was arranged on the mud in rows, sorted. The lost boats were together, lined up by size. The fishing gear was in its own area, the rods laid parallel, the reels stacked. Bottles and cans in their own field, standing upright by type. Tools in rows. 80 years of drowned objects, organized on the lake bed with a care and a logic that no current, no settling, no physical process produces, because physical processes scatter and randomize. They do not sort the world's garbage into a tidy inventory by category. And there was a section for the things that had been alive. I'll say this part as flatly as I can. Animals drown in lakes, deer that fall through ice, dogs, livestock. The bones work down into the mud over decades. Those bones were here too, and they were arranged like the rest, sorted by kind, by size, laid out in clean anatomical order. Every deer skeleton complete and articulated and aligned the same direction. The dogs in their own row, and at the end of that grim catalog, set slightly apart, with the same terrible care, were the human ones. 3 of them. The lake was 80 years old and had taken, that the county could later confirm, exactly 3 people across its history: a swimmer in the 50s, a fisherman in the 70s, a child in the 90s. 3 drownings, decades apart, that no one had ever recovered. All 3 were here, on the mud, complete, articulated, laid out side by side in the same orientation as the deer and the dogs, sorted into the inventory, as though the lake counted them as just 3 more items in a collection it had been keeping and organizing the entire time it pretended to be a lake. We stopped the drawdown. We called the authorities for the human remains, and the recovery was careful and respectful and deeply, deeply unsettling for everyone involved, because you cannot explain to a coroner why a drowning victim from 1956 is lying in clean anatomical articulation, aligned to a compass bearing, in a row with 2 other victims and 100 deer. The dam got its repairs. The lake got refilled. Everything we didn't remove went back under the water: the boats, the bottles, the rows of animal bones, the whole sorted inventory, swallowed again. The thing I think about is the empty spaces. In the human row, laid out with the 3 recovered victims, there were gaps. 3 bodies, but the row had been arranged with even spacing for more. Clear, deliberate intervals left open on the mud beyond the 3rd skeleton, the way you leave shelf space for items you intend to acquire. The lake wasn't just keeping an inventory of what it had taken, it was keeping a room. And we refilled it and put the water back and left those waiting spaces open underneath. And the trail still runs right past it. And people still swim there in the summer, not knowing the water has already measured out where they'll lie. The root cellar, under the shelter. A trail shelter I help maintain sits on the site of an old homestead, common enough. The shelters often reuse old clearings. We knew there'd once been a cabin there. What we didn't know until a section of floor gave way was that the shelter had been built directly over the homestead's root cellar, and the root cellar had been sealed from the inside with the family's belongings stacked against the door by people trying to keep something down there from coming up. I'm a volunteer shelter maintainer. I adopt a backcountry shelter and keep it up, sweep it, fix it, haul out what hikers leave. My shelter sits in an old homestead clearing, which is typical. The early trail builders used existing clear ground, and a lot of shelters stand where mountain families once farmed. We knew a cabin had been there once. There's a chimney fall nearby and the daffodils that always mark an old dooryard. Nice history, nothing ominous. Then a corner of the shelter's plank floor rotted through. It undid, and when I pulled the boards to replace them, there was a void. Under the shelter, a stone-lined room, a root cellar, the old kind dug into the slope to keep vegetables cool. The shelter had been built right on top of it, the floor laid over the cellar's caved roof. And nobody in the trail club's records had known it was there. I went down to assess it because that's the job and because I'm curious, and the cellar told a story I wish it hadn't. The root cellar door, the original heavy plank, on the inside of the cellar at the bottom of the entrance steps, was barricaded from the inside. Stacked against it, from within the cellar, was the family's life: furniture, a butter churn, tools, a child's shoes, crockery, all of it piled against that door in a frantic barricade by people who had gone down into their own root cellar and sealed themselves in against something. The logic was unmistakable and backwards from what you'd expect. People don't barricade themselves into a root cellar to keep something out of the house. You'd run from the cellar. Unless the thing was already in the house and the cellar was the last door you could put between you and it. Except the barricade was on the inside, yes. But the cellar had a second opening. A low passage at the back dug further into the slope, a tunnel going down and in. And the family's barricade against the door at the top of the steps wasn't facing the house above. It was facing the back tunnel. They hadn't sealed themselves in to keep out something from the cabin. They'd sealed the cellar to put a wall between the trail above and whatever came up the tunnel from below, and they'd done it from inside, which meant they never left. There were no remains. The cellar was empty of people, just the barricade, and the child's shoes, and the back tunnel going down into the dark of the mountain, and the long, deep gouges in the stone around the mouth of that tunnel, where something had come up out of it, again and again, and worn grooves in the rock. I came out of that cellar fast. I replaced the floor solid, doubled, sealed it over, and I filed a careful report. And in the Trail Club's position is that it's an interesting historical feature, best left undisturbed, which I wholeheartedly endorse. But I sleep at that shelter sometimes, when I'm working. And the last time, late, I heard it from under the new floor I'd laid, from down in the sealed cellar, the small specific sound of someone stacking things against a door, wood on stone, the scrape and thunk of a barricade being built carefully in the dark, directly beneath where hikers sleep. The family is still down there. They never stopped. 150 years, and they are still piling their lives against that door, still holding the line against the tunnel, still keeping the thing below from coming up through the floor and out into the shelter where, every night, exhausted strangers lie down to sleep without knowing who's protecting them, or from what, or for how much longer they can hold. Chapter 3. Story 8. The bones the flood sorted. Exact word count. 700. Hook, approximately 35 seconds. A 1,000-year flood tore through the valley 2 autumns ago. It scoured the riverbanks down to bedrock, ripped out trees, rearranged the whole landscape, and it dug up a burial ground nobody knew was there, washing the bones downstream. I was on the recovery crew. The flood scattered those bones for miles, but when we found them, they hadn't been scattered. They'd been gathered by the river into one place and assembled. I do disaster recovery search and recovery after floods, mostly the grim work of finding what high water takes. The flood 2 autumns ago was historic, a wall of water that came down the valley. The trail follows and rewrote the terrain, took bridges, took homes, took people. We were out for weeks. Somewhere in the upper valley, the flood had scoured down through a bank and exposed and destroyed an old burial ground unmarked, ancient, the kind that turns up after big floods, predating any record. The high water ripped the graves apart and took the bones downstream. The way a flood takes everything, scattering them through miles of debris field. That's what should have happened. Scattering is what floods do. A flood is the most chaotic force most people will ever see. It randomizes the world, smashes and mixes and disperses. We expected to find those bones the way we find everything, after a flood strewn across miles of mud and wreckage. A fragment here, a fragment there. We found them gathered. Downstream, in a wide gravel bar the flood had built, the bones from that destroyed burial ground had been collected, all of them, it seemed, from a graveyard the flood had torn apart and spread for miles into a single dense deposit. And not just piled, assembled. The crew that found it called me over and nobody was talking, and when I came around the gravel bar I understood why. The bones had been put together into figures. Human figures, reassembled out of the mixed remains of dozens of individuals, articulated a skull from one person, a spine from another, ribs and limbs sorted and fitted, standing or rather propped upright in the gravel. A row of constructed people made of jumbled ancestors, facing upstream, facing the destroyed graveyard they'd been torn out of, as though they'd been assembled to look back at the wound the flood had made, and would not stop looking. Water does not do this. I need you to sit with that the way I had to. Water scatters. Water cannot select a femur and a matching femur from a debris field miles long and set them in anatomical position. Water cannot build a person, let alone a row of them, let alone stand them up and aim them. The flood that did everything a flood does, the chaos, the destruction, the scattering, had also, somehow, in the same event, done the precise opposite. Gathered the dead, it had disinterred and rebuilt them, and stood them in a line. We recovered the remains. It took specialists weeks to even begin sorting the commingled bones back into individuals, and they never fully could because the assembly had mixed them past untangling. The official cause is hydraulic sorting, a real phenomenon where moving water can group objects by size and density. I have read the report. Hydraulic sorting groups, gravel. It does not build standing skeletons out of a dozen people and aim them upstream. What stays with me is what we found at the head of the row, the figure standing slightly ahead of the others, the one the rebuilt dead seemed to be standing behind. It was assembled like the rest, out of mismatched human bone, but it was too tall. The proportions were wrong, the limbs too long, the assembly using the human bones, but arranging them into something that was not shaped like a person. A thing built from us, but not one of us, standing at the front of its congregation of rebuilt dead, facing the torn open grave, the leader of a flood that gathered instead of scattered. We took the human remains for reburial. The thing at the head of the row came apart into its component human bones when we moved it, and went into the commingled inventory, and is now, presumably, buried again with everyone else, disassembled. But I think about what I assembled it. The flood didn't build that. Something used the flood. And the next 1,000-year flood is only a matter of time. And the bones are back in the ground. And whatever gathers them is patient on a scale that makes 1,000 years a reasonable wait. The time capsule. A trail club buried a time capsule in 1974 to be opened in 50 years, a steel box near a shelter, full of letters and photos and a list of the members who buried it. I was at the ceremony as a kid when they put it in. I was there, 50 years later when they dug it up. The capsule was intact, sealed, exactly where they buried it. But the things inside it were not the things we put in. They were things from the 50 years that hadn't happened yet. I've been part of the same trail club my whole life. In 1974, when I was a boy, the club buried a time capsule near one of our shelters, a sealed steel box with a brass plaque to be dug up in 50 years. It was a big deal. They put in letters to the future, photographs, a newspaper, a club roster, the ordinary hopeful contents of a time capsule. I watched them lower it into the hole and shovel the dirt over it. I remember it clearly because they let the kids throw the first handfuls of soil. 50 years later, 2 years ago now, the club gathered to dig it up. Some of us who'd been kids at the burial were the old guard now. A few who'd been adults in 1974 were still living, ancient, brought up the trail to see it. We dug at the plaque. The box was there, exactly where it had been buried. The soil above it undisturbed. The steel sound, the seal intact. 50 years underground, untouched. We pried it open with a real ceremony. The contents were wrong. The letters were there, but they were not the letters written in 1974. They were letters written to us, the people standing around the hole by name, dated across the 50 years that had supposedly just passed, describing events from our lives that had genuinely happened. My divorce, a club member's son's death the year the blight took the hemlocks, written in our own handwriting, signed by us except none of us had written them, and several were signed by members who'd been alive in 1974 and had since died, in hands we recognized, dated after their deaths. The photographs were not the 1974 photos. They were photographs of the 50 years between the club's hikes, our weddings, our funerals, real moments, real people, except many were moments no camera had been present for, and a few were of events that had not happened yet that I am now watching come true one by one as the months pass, and the roster, the 1974 club roster, was supposed to list the members who buried the capsule. Instead, the box held a roster of every member across the 50 years, including the ones who joined decades after the burial, including me as an adult, including children not yet born in 1974, and beside many names, a date, a death date. Some of those dates are in the past now, and they were all correct. Some of them are in the future. Mine is on the list. I know the year I will die. It is not far. The box was sealed. The soil was undisturbed. 50 years, no one touched it. And it contained the 50 years we hadn't lived yet when we buried it, recorded as they happened, by hands that hadn't lived them, sealed in steel the whole time, growing the contents the way a seed grows a tree, in the dark, underground, waiting for us to dig up our own completed lives. The club doesn't talk about it. We reburied the box, voted on it formally, and put it back in the ground, sealed with the new contents inside, because nobody could think what else to do with a box full of our own deaths. We filled the hole. We did not make a new plaque. I'll tell you the worst part. The part I check obsessively. The roster listed the death dates of everyone. Several members on that list with future dates have since died on the dates the buried box predicted exactly. The capsule is right every time. And I have realized slowly over 2 years that the box did not predict our deaths. A prediction can be wrong. The box has never been wrong. The box is not telling us when we'll die. It buried our lives 50 years ago, finished, and we are only now catching up to the ground's version, walking into a future that was already in the box, already over, already sealed and waiting under the trail. The quarry's bottom. There's a flooded quarry near the trail, 100 feet of cold green water in a pit of cut stone, a popular and dangerous swimming hole. Divers go in sometimes and don't come back. The county finally drained it to recover the bodies and close it for good. They got the bodies out. But the quarry was deeper than the records said, far deeper, And at the true bottom, below where any swimmer ever drowned, was a door cut into the stone, with steps going down. I was the county official who finally got the old quarry drained, so this one's on me, and I've made my peace with very little of it. The quarry's a flooded pit granite, cut a century ago, abandoned, filled with spring water and runoff until it was 100-foot deep pool of beautiful lethal green water. Generations swam there despite the fences. Generations drowned there too. Divers who went down to recover them sometimes joined them. The place was a magnet and a graveyard. After the third diver's death, I pushed it through. Drain the quarry, recover whoever was down there, backfill it, end it. It took months and a lot of pumps. We pulled the water down 100 feet, through green to black, and as the bottom emerged, we recovered remains, the drowned of decades, found at the depths you'd expect, the sad arithmetic of a place that kills people. But the quarry kept going. The records said the quarry was 100 feet deep. The pumps hit 100 feet, and there was still water below and stone walls still descending, and we kept pumping, and the pit went down another 60 feet past where it was supposed to end, past where any swimmer had ever been, past the depth where any of the drowned were found. 160 feet down, in cut granite that no quarrying record accounts for. The pumps finally sucked air, and we looked down into the true bottom of a quarry that was far deeper than anyone had dug it. There was a door at the bottom. Cut into the stone of the lowest wall, below all the water, below all the dead, a doorway, squared, deliberate, framed in worked stone, with steps leading down through it into a passage that went deeper still into the rock, below the bottom of the pit. The quarrymen a century ago had not cut this. It was older than the quarry. The quarry, I came to understand, standing at the rail looking down, had not been dug to this depth. The quarry had been dug by men cutting stone for buildings, and at some point a century ago they had cut into something already there, a passage, a stairway, down, and they had flooded the quarry, deliberately or in panic, to seal it. The 100 feet of green water everyone drowned in for a century was a plug, a lid. Put it there on purpose, to keep that door at the bottom underwater and shut. And I had just pumped the lid off. I did not send anyone down those steps. I want that on the record. I stood at the bottom of a drained quarry and looked at an ancient doorway with stairs descending into the mountain. And every drowned swimmer we just recovered was suddenly a different kind of warning, not victims of a dangerous swimming hole, but the price of keeping the lid full. The water took a life now and then. Maybe that was the rent. Maybe the drownings were the quarry doing its job, keeping itself deep and full and shut. And the divers who vanished hadn't drowned at all, but had gone down too far and found the door. I ordered it backfilled immediately. Not water rock and concrete, the door buried under thousands of tons of fill, the quarry packed solid to the rim, the swimming hole erased, the steps and the passage and whatever waits at the bottom of them sealed under stone instead of water. But here's what I think about. What makes me a coward who did the cowardly right thing? We sealed it with rock instead of water. The original builders chose water. Maybe they knew something. Maybe the thing below could be held under 100 feet of water indefinitely, but doesn't mind stone. Can wait stone out. Can come up through fill the way it never could through the weight of all that cold green pressure. Maybe I didn't seal the door. Maybe I just took away the lock that was working and replaced it with one that won't. The trail runs right past where the quarry was. It's a meadow now, reclaimed, pretty. People picnic there. I don't. The ice that kept its catch. A glacier doesn't belong in the southern Appalachians, but the last ice age left ice in the high hollows that, in the coldest pockets, never fully melted relict ice, buried under rock and shielded from the sun for 10,000 years. A landslide near the trail exposed a face of that ancient buried ice. And frozen in it, 10,000 years deep, perfectly preserved, were things that had been hunting up here since before the ice came. Still hunting, just paused. I'm a glaciologist, which sounds absurd for the southern Appalachians, but there's real science here. The last ice age reached these mountains, and in certain high, shaded, rock-shielded hollows, remnant ice relict ice, buried and insulated under talus, can persist for an astonishingly long time. There are documented ice caves and cold pockets in these mountains where the air stays freezing year-round. I study them. They are windows into 10,000 years ago. A landslide near the trail after a wet winter sheared open a slope and exposed something none of us knew was there. A face of buried ancient ice, deep in a talus-shielded hollow. Ice that by every measure had been sealed under rock since the Pleistocene. 10,000 years old. A solid wall of it suddenly opened to the air, and inside it, because ice preserves like nothing else, better than peat, better than bog, were inclusions. Things frozen in. We expected Pleistocene material, pollen, maybe insects, ideally a frozen plant or animal that would be a genuine scientific treasure. What was in the ice was an animal, yes, but not one in any record. Frozen in the 10,000-year-old ice, perfectly preserved, was a creature mid-motion caught, running or hunting low to the ground, long too many limbs articulated in a gait no mammal uses, jaws open, and in those jaws, also frozen, was prey, a smaller animal that I could identify, a Pleistocene mountain goat, a real and known extinct species, clamped in the jaws of a predator that is in no fossil record, no taxonomy, nothing. A hunter caught in the act of a kill 10,000 years ago and frozen exactly so, paused mid-bite by ice that came down fast enough to stop time. We did what scientists do. We cut a block of the ice containing the creature, packed it frozen, and brought it down to a cold lab for study, because this was the find of a career, of a lifetime, of the field. The ice block began to thaw in transit despite our cooling a refrigeration failure, the kind of mundane equipment problem that ruins specimens. We raced it to the lab freezer. We were too late by an hour, maybe less. When we opened the transport case in the lab, the ice had melted enough to free the inclusion. The case was empty. The melted water was there, pooled in the case. The Pleistocene goat was there, thawed, real dead 10,000 years, a perfect and genuine specimen. But the predator, the thing that had been frozen mid-kill, the impossible hunter, the find of the century, was gone, not decomposed, not dissolved. Gone the way something is gone when it is gotten up and left, because it was never dead. It had been paused. Frozen mid-hunt, mid-bite, mid-life, 10,000 years ago, and the ice had not killed it. The ice had only stopped it. And when the ice failed in the back of our truck, the creature simply resumed, finished its bite 10,000 years late, found the goat already dead and uninteresting, and left the open transport case in a cold lab to go and be a predator in a world that had moved on 10,000 years without it. We never recovered it. We never reported the full truth. Who would believe it, and what would we even say? The official record notes a valuable Pleistocene goat specimen and an unfortunate refrigeration failure that lost associated material. That's the lie I helped write. The hollow's ice face has since refrozen and rebuilt, sealing itself, and we have not gone back. But the thing is loose. It came out of 10,000 years of ice mid-hunt, hungry, fast, built for a kind of killing that hasn't existed since the megafauna, and it is somewhere in these mountains now, and the trail runs right through its old hunting grounds. I think about the hikers. I think about how a thing that hunted Pleistocene goats would regard a slow, soft, modern human alone on a quiet stretch of trail. And I think the ice should have kept its catch, and I am the one who let it melt. The survey stakes. I'm a surveyor. I was hired to lay out the boundary of a parcel adjacent to the trail that hadn't been surveyed in over a century. Routine. I drove my stakes along the property lines from the old deed, but when I came back the next day to continue, my stakes had been moved overnight, redriven into the ground in a new pattern, enclosing a different shape entirely. And the shape they now enclosed matched no property line. It matched something much older and much worse. Surveying is the least mystical profession I can imagine, which is exactly why this still rattles me. I find corners, I shoot lines, I drive stakes, I make the invisible legal boundaries of the world visible. It's math, history, and walking. There are no ghosts in surveying. I was hired to resurvey a large parcel next to the trail, undeveloped, that hadn't had a proper survey in over 100 years. The old deed was vague. Meets and bounds, thence to the chestnut oak, that kind of antique description, and the new owner needed real lines. I spent a day working the old calls, finding what corners I could, and driving fresh survey stakes wood lath, with bright flagging along the boundary as I reconstructed it. Ordinary day? I left my stakes in the ground to continue the next morning. The next morning the stakes had moved, not vandalized, not pulled out and thrown, redriven. Every stake I'd placed was now in a new position, set firmly in the ground, flagging intact, as if I'd placed them there myself, but enclosing a completely different shape. My boundary had been a rough rectangle following the deed. The stakes now describe something else, a closed curve, deliberate, with my stakes at precise intervals along it, a shape that ran through the woods with intention and enclosed a specific patch of forest that the deed's lines did not. I assumed a prank or a dispute with a neighbor, and I reset everything to the correct deed lines and added a note to my field book and went home irritated. The next morning they'd moved again. Same new shape, my corrected stakes, redriven overnight back into the curve, patiently by something that wanted that exact shape marked and was willing to undo my work every night to get it. So I did what a surveyor does. I surveyed the shape they wanted. I shot the curve the stakes kept insisting on, recorded it precisely, and brought the coordinates home to plot it, because if something was going to fight me every night, I at least wanted to know what I was drawing. The shape was not random, and it was not a property line when I plotted it against historical records, old maps, the original land grants, the county's antique surveys. It matched. It matched the boundary of a parcel that had been surveyed once before in the original grant, and then deliberately removed from all subsequent records. A piece of land that someone, 2 centuries ago, had carefully unmapped, surveyed once, and then erased the lines struck from the deeds the parcel absorbed into its neighbors on paper, the shape removed from the official world on purpose. My stakes were redrawing a boundary that had been intentionally forgotten. Something inside that erased parcel wanted its lines marked again. Wanted to be on the map. Wanted, after 200 years of being deliberately unsurveyed, to be found. I quit the job. I told the owner the parcel had boundary issues beyond my ability to resolve, which was true, and I gave back the fee, which I have never done before or since. I did not file the survey of the curve. I did not put that shape back on any map. Whatever wanted to be remembered, I left forgotten. And I tell myself that was the right call. But here's what makes me wonder. Surveys are how land becomes real. Legally, officially, an unsurveyed parcel is a kind of nothing, a gap in the record. Land that the world has agreed not to see. For 200 years, that shape has been a hole in the map. And something has been inside that hole. And the only thing keeping it there, keeping it nowhere, is that no one has drawn its lines. I almost did. I almost made it real again. Officially, on the map found, I plotted those coordinates and I held the finished drawing in my hand. And I have wondered every day since whether the thing in the erased parcel needs someone to draw its boundary before it can cross it, and whether by plotting that curve even once, even unfiled, I gave it the edges it's been waiting 2 centuries to have. What I reburied. This last one is mine, and it's the only one where I'm not the witness, I'm the cause. I dug something up that should have stayed buried knowingly because I wanted it. I've spent the years since putting it back, piece by piece, and I'm not finished. And I'm telling you this as a kind of confession, because I don't think I'm going to get to finish. And someone should know what's still out there in the ground where I left it, half returned. I'll close with my own, and mine is different from all the others because in every story I've told you tonight, someone disturbed something by accident: a drought, a flood, a landslide, a survey, a drainage. They didn't mean to dig up what they found. I did. I knew exactly what I was doing. That's the difference, and it's the whole reason I'm the one who has to tell it. I won't say precisely what I was professionally because it would identify me, and there are still consequences I'm avoiding. I'll say I had access to places along the trail that ordinary people don't, and knowledge of what was in the ground in those places, and I used both. I had heard the stories, the same stories I've spent tonight telling you, the buried things, the sealed places, the warnings carved into stone. I had come to believe, over a long career, that they were true. And believing they were true, I made the single worst decision a person can make. I decided I wanted what was buried more than I feared why it was buried. I went alone to a place I knew, where something had been put in the ground a very long time ago with great care to keep it down. There was a marker. There was a warning. In the way these always have a warning, I read it. I understood it. And I dug anyway, because I am the kind of fool who thinks the warning is for other people. The ones who don't understand what they're handling. I understood. I thought that made it safe. It does the opposite. The warnings are written for exactly the people who understand, because we're the only ones tempted to dig. I'm not going to describe what I took out of the ground. I've spent the years since trying to unknow it, and describing it would undo that work. I'll only say that I was right. It was real. It was what the story said. It was extraordinary. And that being right was the worst thing that ever happened to me, because the moment I had it out and exposed and in my hands, I understood with total clarity why every culture that ever encountered it had spent such effort putting it down. And I understood that I had just undone, in one greedy afternoon, work that had cost people their lives to do. So I have been putting it back. That's what I do now. It is not as simple as reburying it. That's the thing the stories don't tell you. Once a thing like that is up, it does not go down easily, and it does not go down whole. I have been returning it to the ground in pieces, in the right places, in the right ways, learning as I go what the original burials knew, paying in installments a price I can't fully pay. Some of it is back, most of it, not all, and I am running out of time. My body, my circumstances, the consequences I mentioned, I don't think I will finish. So this is the confession, and it's also the warning, and it's also, I suppose, the handoff. There is a thing along the Appalachian Trail that was buried with great care, and a fool dug it up. The fool has put most of it back, but not all. And when the fool is gone, the part that's still out is going to need someone to finish the reburial, and they will not have the warning carved in stone, because I took that too. So let this be the warning. Somewhere out there, the ground is open that should be closed. Most of it I've returned. The rest I'm marking the only way I have left in words in the dark, to strangers. If the stories find you, if you're the kind who understands them, the way I did understand this instead, the warnings are for you, especially for you. Leave it buried. Finish what I couldn't. Or better, never start. I dug up the one thing that should have stayed down, and I have spent my life putting it back. And it still isn't enough. And it never will be. That's the one that keeps me up. Not a thing I saw, a thing I did. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to Park Ranger Narrative. Some places are quiet for a reason,